Reframing Title IX, A Social Justice Perspective. My name is Stacy Falk. I'm from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I will be facilitating. So just a few things. This webinar will be about 50 minutes in length with time saved throughout the broadcast for you to ask any questions. We do not have to wait until the end of the broadcast. And you should be able to view right now the presentation on your screen. If you don't, please type in the chat box. This webinar will be available on the AIMHO website soon after. And I hope you can all hear me as you're watching this webinar. I've muted the microphone, so I will not be able to hear you if you ask any questions. So again, please use the chat box. And before we get started, we want to know who's on the webinar so we can accurately count the number of attendees. So could you please type in the chat box the name of your school and the number of total people that are present with you. If you do have any questions, there's a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your computer monitor. You please use the chat box to submit any questions, and then we will answer those questions throughout the broadcast. We will not wait until the end. And also, feel free to tweet any comments at AIMHO365. So again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. So let's welcome Alex Dubois, Community Director, and Jen Hiatt, Executive Director of University of Arizona, who will be able to start us off.
Hello, everyone. This is Alex. As Stacy said, I am a community director at the University of Arizona, and I'm currently also a PhD student who is studying sexual violence in Title IX on college campuses. Jen?
And I'm Jen Hiatt, and I'm the Executive Director of Residence Life and University Housing here at the University of Arizona. And we're thrilled to have you with us today. We're sorry for the snafu last week, but we promise today will be riveting and inspiring. And I also wanted to thank Alex because she is the mastermind behind our awesome presentation today. So we hope that you'll engage with us and ask us lots of questions.
And before we begin, both Jen and I, Jen is actually the chair of the Diversity and Social Justice Committee for AIMHO. We just wanted to throw that out there. But please feel free to ask us any questions at any time. And so as we begin, I want to clarify the goals of this webinar. So neither Jen nor myself are law experts, at least rather I'm not a law expert. I don't know about Jen. I won't speak for you. But we're not offering a purely legal perspective in this webinar. We wanted to really talk about Title IX from a social justice perspective today. And so specifically that includes how we as student affairs professionals, as housing officers, how can we respond to violence, issues of gender violence and inequity on our campuses while also navigating areas that we might not be as familiar with, including the law. And so I just wanted to preface that by saying, so we're not going to focus entirely on this is what you have to do to remain in compliance. We're going to talk about different issues that we think are important to consider when you're thinking about how do you respond to Title IX. And so Jen is going to start us off.
So the question that we asked ourselves is why do we care about this? And as you may recently have seen, there are many institutions that are facing investigations under Title IX. And what Alex and I just spoke of as we were getting ready for this morning is that number seems to be increasing every day. So the number that you see on your screen right now that says over 60 schools are under investigation for violating Title IX, it actually probably is closer to 70. And the ones that seemed most fascinating to us were the three: Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Oregon. I'm going to talk about them probably in reverse order because I think many of you have heard more recently about the University of Oregon case where a female student attending that institution has alleged that some of the basketball players on the team sexually assaulted her. And she not only then let the institution know about this sexual assault, she has since then written a formal letter, open letter. Her identity is still not released as of yesterday evening, and although what she's alleging is there their lack of response and their decision to allow the basketball players to continue to play in the NCAA tournament was one of the reasons why she felt like they were reticent to continually investigate her allegations. Harvard is another fascinating one, and I don't know how many of you have paid attention to this in terms of the release of the White House task force that promised to provide better government transparency in all of these. So when you think about that, what they're basically saying with this task force is we are going to tell you the institutions now who we are beginning to pay attention to. We may not tell you the complexity of the case, but we're definitely going to state their names. And in these last few weeks, that's precisely what they've done. They've continued to say, here are the institutions, and here's exactly like how we want to proceed. But what's great about this other task force article was Barack Obama coming out to say that he was citing research and basically saying 1 in 5 female students are assaulted on our college campuses, and believing that the more we allow these instances to come to light, the better we will be as an entire United States in actually taking these very, very seriously. So the second point is that's the critique, is that higher education is basically saying that what we care about is our brand and not necessarily our students. So we're more interested in making sure that we don't lose any students in the future, and as opposed to saying this incident did happen and here's kind of where we're headed for it. And honestly, that's what in the University of Oregon case seems to be coming to light, is the reason that she felt, that the alleged victim felt they were dragging their feet was because of the NCAA basketball tournament. So how does this affect our institutions? Clearly, retention. It would potentially affect alumni giving, also capital campaigns. These negative stories produce a feeling around the alumni, and are they willing to give to either an annual campaign or a capital campaign? And obviously, there's a potentiality for implications with federal funding. So what we want to say is institutions have to first and foremost be committed to the students. And irrespective of what things end up, whether it's in the Chronicle of Higher Education or whether it's in our local papers, our commitment should be to making sure that our students have a fair process.
And so that's really what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about how do we balance all of these considerations and also focus on being socially just. So today's session will discuss how Title IX is a social justice issue and what our role as housing officers is and what we can do to navigate the university's legal issues to find resources and assist students through their experiences so that they feel safe and they feel respected and that their dignity is valued. We also want to discuss some potential policies that departments can adopt or at least can consider when they're responding to or trying to prevent assault. And we want to really stress, like, how do you balance being compliant with being compassionate toward our students and, again, maintaining a student-first perspective. And so let's first talk about how can we discuss Title IX from a social justice perspective. And so Title IX, essentially what it boils down to is it prohibits discrimination based on sex and gender. And so understanding Title IX, because it is so rooted in identity, this requires us to understand different intersections of oppression, particularly along lines of gender, sexual orientation, race, ability. And so this means that we have to have a basic knowledge of sexism, heterosexism, racism, ableism. And so Jen and I are not going to go into those particular concepts in depth at this moment, but we did want to offer a good primer, and that is Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. And it has solid information to learn more about those topics in depth. What's really important today is understanding that oppression manifests itself on our campuses. And we as educators must be willing to talk about that. And we have to be able to at least recognize we need to learn more about sexism, racism, heterosexism, ableism, anything that could be contributing to this issue, because we know that all of these issues intersect with one another and we don't operate in a vacuum. When you also talk about social justice from a Title IX from a social justice perspective, it also requires us to recognize triggers, and that includes things that might be triggering to students who are going through this experience. And it also means recognizing the triggers that are in ourselves. We as professionals are not immune to feeling discrimination. Some of us might identify as survivors, and some of us might be put into situations where we need to understand how can I, in a healthy manner, navigate this issue in a way that I'm not triggered, or I am recognizing my triggers and I'm feeling safe and comfortable and have the support I need to do my job. And we also want to be aware of the ways that the dynamics of our own personal triggers might intersect with different identities or different ways that sexism and racism might manifest on our campus. Because we're talking about Title IX, and Title IX at its core is about responding to or investigating acts of violence. And we don't always think of like verbal harassment or minor things as violent behavior, but that's really what it is. Harassment, inequity, those are perpetual acts of violence that make our students feel unsafe, unwelcome, or that they're not valued. And so it's really important that we take all of these things into consideration and we recognize violence and its impact for what it is. Going back to triggers, it's really important, too, that staff recognize the language and behavior that, that could trigger students as we're working with them. Again, our job, we want to minimize harm. We want our students to feel safe and valued. And so when we're dealing with issues of Title IX or dealing with students who may be going through something, maybe have been attacked or harassed or assaulted, we need to understand what can we do, what can we say that will provide them with what they need and value them as people. And finally, the last topic, and this is really important, and I'm going to actually go on to the next slide to talk about this too, is when you talk about Title IX from a social justice perspective, it requires an exploration of how violence is normalized on our campus and within our larger culture. Because we know that there are ways in which violence can be perpetuated on our campuses, and we have to be prepared to talk about the different relationships between violence and alcohol or drug use, or between different campus culture and rituals, and that's stuff that we just have to be prepared to discuss. So it's important for us to remember that colleges don't operate in a vacuum. We are a product of our larger culture. And so it's really important that we have to recognize the ways in which our culture might perpetuate violence, particularly against women, and that's present on our college campuses. It's not uncommon for people, particularly women, to report feeling harassed while attempting to go about their day. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter or are familiar with this, but the Twitter handle @EverydaySexism really highlights the ways in which women are regularly harassed from walking down the street, from being at work, running errands, just doing their day-to-day things. And so this Twitter handle, women can type in and say, this is my experience today. Today I was harassed when I was going on a run. Today XYZ happened to me. All of these horrifying stories of regular, everyday events of violence that happen to women. And we know that this happens to them every day. And these are behaviors that are also present on our campuses. And that's really crucial for us to remember that just because we're on a college campus, we want to create safe campuses. We want to have safe residence halls. But we can't always make everything perfectly safe. And so we know that we need to be prepared to respond when acts of violence come up. And this is a bit of a horrifying statistic or piece of information, but a recent study just released this year demonstrates that violence is becoming increasingly normalized. Young girls are, and women are increasingly thinking that abusive behavior is normal and to be expected. So we have women on our campuses who just expect that if they go out, they're going to be harassed. They expect that that men will treat them in certain ways. They expect to get certain comments that actually, when you look at them, are abusive. They are not normal. But for whatever reason, our society is slowly telling our girls and our women particularly that this stuff is normal and you just need to live with it. And they're believing it. And this should scare us as educators. We need to be prepared to respond in ways that recognize social injustice as the root of violence. And we need to also shape our policies that address this appropriately. We need to encourage women and girls, encourage any victims of violence to not become desensitized to harassment and violence, to stress that this is not okay on our campuses. And we have to consider the full scope of violence, everything from verbal harassment to assault. And we need to communicate things such as affirmative consent, respect for others and boundaries, and shape our policies to let students know that this is not okay and acceptable on our campuses. And that's why taking a social justice framework with Title IX is so important. I'm going to turn to Jen for some statistics now.
So here's some background information. 62% of women and 61% of men admit to being sexually harassed on college campuses. 19% of women and 6% of men admit to being sexually assaulted during college. And then finally, we must understand, what is our role in reducing assault and harassment on campus and making students feel safer? What was interesting to us also is, to state it bluntly, sexual assault and rape more often affects women than men, and in most instances, men are the perpetrators. It's equally important to state that while women are more likely to be attacked, it is a very small percentage of men who are offenders. So the best way for us to say that is that most of them are repeat offenders, meaning men are repeatedly offending a larger percentage of women. And these statistics are crucial to know when developing a response to sexual violence on campus, because there's an effort that we need to build with men and women who are far more effective in relying just on women's perspectives. The more we can help men understand the role that they play in all of this, the better it will be for our institutions. What's fascinating about this, I wanted to bring in a recent case study, and this one was interesting to me and to Alex because of the context that it wasn't a student, yet still was happening on an institution's campus. This is happening right now at Montana State University Northern, where they recently had released their provost. And the background of this story is the provost who was there, her name is Rosalind Templeton. She repeatedly is accused of touching a faculty member there. And this went on for a long time, and the faculty member felt as if he had to avoid the provost. He began to talk about this. He started talking about it within his department, and eventually it was brought all the way to the president's attention. So finally, the president decides to let this the provost leave the institution. Again, then they start a search for a new faculty member. And then the first rendition of the job description that came out, it was open to anyone who was a faculty member. One day later, their president, Waded Cruzado-Sados, decided that she wanted to say you had to be a full faculty member. So what the faculty member who feels as if he had been sexually assaulted is stating in a case that literally had deposition yesterday, and he's asking for $100,000 worth of damages, is that the reason he was excluded from being able to apply for this position was because he complained. So during the time that provost was there, and that the change was about excluding him from the ability to apply for this position. So even we do want to talk about how does this affect our students, because that's clearly important. What was interesting to us about this article is it's clearly also affecting upper administration and faculty members as well. All right, so what is our role in this? So we believe that we are conduits, that one of the best things we can do for students and faculty and staff is to always translate policy into practice. So that is taking even basic information like what Alex and I are giving you today and constantly weaving it into everything that we do, from policies to procedures, but also to how we interact with folks on a daily basis. We should have that ability to say, what you're telling me, the story you're explaining to me is not okay, and let me tell you let me give you some options in terms of how you can speak your mind. So we're practitioners of student development theory. So the more we know, the more we are around people who understand student development theory, the better it will be. It'll help us to inform the way we speak about this policy, inform the way we think about when Alex and I were talking about this, one of the fascinating things is we feel like we can't even keep up with this. No matter, whether 4 hours goes by or 4 days go by, whenever I go back out there to look, something interesting has happened. And it's hard because we don't have law backgrounds. And all we're really limited to is what can we see from the court of public opinion, which is how do people feel about this, but also what's the best way to handle these situations when they come up, particularly when there's two sides to every story. So even in the story that I just gave you about Montana State Northern, you could look at that from both sides. You could say that what he's alleging never happened, but what you have to do is what exactly they're doing, which is providing a format, a legal format for every single person to be investigated and be able to tell their story. Remember, we work with students, and we have access to students that no other administrator on our campus may have, and I would include even professors. I think the likelihood of a student talking to somebody about something that happened to them is more likely to happen to someone who works with us in housing, because they're closest to us in terms of proximity, but also in terms of relationships. And the more we can help people learn, here's the best way for us to inform our practices and our policies, the better. Alex?
Yep. So as Jen said, we balance a lot of things. We wear different hats. We have to be educators and communicate with students about policy, about Title IX. Often we are first responders. I know that, for instance, if you serve on any kind of duty or on-call rotation, many times you might be responding to crises or having to deal with someone who this experience has happened to, who has been attacked. We have to be resources, and we have to know other offices to refer students to. We have to know what's available to students. And it's really difficult. This requires a balancing act. Depending on the situation, we have to wear a certain hat, and we have to strike the appropriate balance between these roles, while also recognizing that some of us might have our own personal feelings, things that are going on with us, and we still have to be professional and still have to respond. And that can be something that's very difficult. And basically what that boils down to is, if we're going to be effective in responding to sexual violence, we have to have a thorough understanding of the different ways our roles intersect. And we need to know how to talk about Title IX and sexual assault. And so this means starting from the beginning. What is Title IX? Well, we've already told this brilliant group what Title IX is, but many students, I get asked by this by a lot of students who have a limited understanding of what Title IX encompasses. And fortunately, recent news cycles are beginning to educate the public a little more about Title IX, but many people still believe it's only concerned with athletics or equal opportunities for men and women, and don't understand the full language or the nuance of the law. And that's true, but we as housing officers must do what we can to dispel myths about what Title IX is and isn't. And we have a unique opportunity to do that from the very first day that students move in. We see students even before they see classes or they start going to classes. And so how we start communicating about healthy relationships, healthy sexual behaviors, those are things that we have the power to do. And so we're in this unique role of being good communicators. In that role as a good communicator, too, we need to develop competency around talking about gender, violence, LGBT and trans identities, rape culture, and affirmative consent, because at its root, Title IX is about gender. And some of us might feel really uncomfortable talking about personal identities. Some of us might not know where to start, but this is a competency that we have to develop, because we know that these issues tend to affect women, members of the LGBT community, more disproportionately than other communities. And so having an awareness of what do those intersections look like, how someone responds to sexual violence will be different based on the context and their environment and what's going on. And so we need to have some competency, or at least understand different resources that are available to us to help us navigate that with our students. We also need to acknowledge the impact of violence on both the accusers and the accused. And Jen really talked about this and highlighted it in her example. It's a balancing act, and it's difficult, and this is an area in which us as professionals can have a really hard time, because we might have personal feelings that come up about a particular situation, and we need to balance due process with validating feelings and recognizing the impact that sexual trauma, sexual violence has on students and on anyone, really. And so there are times it is completely within the realm of possibility that we will need to interact with both students who are accusing another individual of hurting them, or someone who has themselves been accused of acting inappropriately or violently toward another student. And these conversations are difficult and scary, and it's important to go back to that do no harm or minimizing harm mentality. You don't want to cross legal boundaries and by saying, oh yeah, don't worry about XYZ. You want to know where you stand legally, but you also want to be able to offer compassion and care to any student involved. And really what that means is listening. You need to listen and hear what they're saying. What do they need? What do the students need? What does anyone need to remain safe within the institution? And listen seriously and take seriously what they say, and work with your staff, work with investigators and general counsel if applicable, to resolve the issue in a way that upholds the law while also recognizing and validating students' concerns.
All right, so navigating the law, we want to talk a little bit about how do you know your campus resources. And in AIMHO, one of the things that is so awesome about it is how different our institutions are. And so many of us at these larger public institutions, we have the ability to have in-house general counsel, meaning that folks actually work here and help guide us in terms of our policies, our procedures, and how we will manage these cases, not only in general, but when the specific circumstance comes up that is different, they would advise us and say, here's some things we think you should consider. But I know that at smaller institutions, you may not have in-house general counsel. You may have a lawyer in town who may or may not be as well versed at this. So what we want to know is what are other community connections that might be able to assist you. So if you have an in-town lawyer that's helping you, or maybe even that lawyer is not in your town, how do you get other resources and other people who can say, the best thing you can do in this situation is, and then fill in the blank. Yet, for those institutions who do have large in-house general counsels, what are ways in which we can continue to educate people on here's some cases that have happened that we've read about, and here's some ways that other institutions have learned some valuable lessons. Obviously, the idea of due diligence, knowing what your state laws are, knowing the federal policy, and being able and ready to communicate this anytime that you're able to, and as well as continue to stay up to date on it. I talk so much with my staff about where's your elevator speech, because you never know who you're going to end up in an elevator with, and they may ask you a question about a recent event, and are you able to clearly that you, Alex?
This is me. I'm back. I don't know what happened.
I think all of us went off.
Gotcha.
So it sounds like, I guess everyone might be able to hear us. I don't know what what was the last thing you heard me say, Alex?
The last thing I heard you say was, hang on, my screen is going funky, was something about due diligence.
Diligence, okay. All right, hold on, let me get back to that.
Sure.
So Stacy, are you there? Can we tell if they're there with us?
The audience is there, they can hear.
Awesome. Hi, audience.
Hi, audience. Okay. All right, so the other part I wanted to talk a little bit about was just the specifics of the Dear Colleague letter. And so many of you know about this and the White House Task Force, but I wanted to bring up a couple key points in terms of what made this so important and such a time for all of us to pay attention. When they issued this, they also issued some key points that said, why are they issuing the Dear Colleague letter? And one part that I found really interesting was to explain the requirements of Title IX, cover sexual violence, and to remind schools of their responsibility to take immediate and effective steps to respond to sexual violence. But what they also talked about is, what does it do? What is its jurisdiction? And what would a school's obligation be under Title IX? Those are pieces of information that you might want to put in the hands of all of your staff members, as well as the continuing to work with your staff from, are they properly trained with the law, and how can you make sure that they even keep up to date on the White House Task Force? And again, I can't reiterate this enough. Even when Alex and I kind of put the finishing touches on this presentation last week, we still felt like there were some parts that we needed to go back through and listen and make sure that we left no stone unturned.
Am I set to move forward?
Yes. Sorry.
Alrighty. No, you're quite all right. I just want to make sure. I know that our slides got a little out of whack there with whatever happened. We were cut off. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about how do we balance compliance with compassion. So this is something that we've been talking about, and this can be something that we really struggle with, particularly if you are trying to balance all sides, all stories of an issue, and that can bring up a lot of feelings, and a lot of different things might be going on in yourself as a professional. And so how can you really balance being in compliance with the law, making sure you're doing what you need to do as an individual and as a professional, while also making sure that you value that student or that person in front of you? And so we're going to talk about listening, supporting, and challenging. So it's imperative to listen to students and to respect what they communicate to you. And so this means demonstrating that you understand what they're saying, that you care about them, and that you're willing to work with them to get them the resources they need. But it also sometimes means offering them space and time to process sexual violence, sexual harassment. It's traumatic, and it can be traumatic in a way that many students or many people are unfamiliar with. So you need to provide time and space for a student to really fully understand what is going on with them and provide them what they need, supply them the appropriate resources. However, and this goes back to what we talked about balancing, like you might have a situation in which you're speaking with a student, an accused and the accuser, and it's okay to look and challenge and push back against shaming behavior or attitudes or rape myths. So you might, in your conversations, in your investigations, you might come across people who will make comments that blame victims or assign faults to inanimate objects like clothing or alcohol. And it's okay as professionals to push back against that and say, it doesn't matter what you think, if you think that clothing or alcohol were factors. What's important is all of our students deserve to be valued and respected, and that means listening to what they're saying and not dismissing them. Not dismissing them and not saying things that would blame them if they're victims, not saying things that would make them feel ashamed for coming forward. It's important, again, whether or not you're speaking with a student who is accusing someone else or the accused student, every student deserves value and respect and dignity. And so our job as professionals is to push back against anything that might challenge that. And that includes not being afraid to challenge students when they might make comments about rape myths or say things such as that person deserved that because X, Y, Z. That's what we don't want. We don't want anyone to feel that they are demeaned or should feel ashamed for coming forward, because we know that this is a sensitive issue. And so we really want all of our students to feel that we care about them, and we're going to do everything in our power to get them what they need to make them, again, feel safe and valued and respected on our campus. And the other thing is we also need to be unafraid to have honest conversations with students about what healthy relationships look like, what healthy behaviors look like. And we need to be proactive in communicating things such as affirmative consent or respect or boundaries. And that's stuff that we in housing, especially with our programming and the nature of our roles, that's something that we do have an ability to do. And so we need to be prepared to do that ourselves and to teach our RAs to have those kinds of conversations as well, because we want, overall, we want to have a healthy and safe environment for everyone. Jen already went into discussing this, but going back to my point, it's really important to remember the human impact. These are students and they're not statistics, and so don't lose sight of the person that you're working with. Regardless of whether they're the accuser or the accused, remember to put them first. It's really important that you as a professional have conversations with your staff, whether it's your staff of fellow professionals or your student staff members, about how to have conversations about responding to sexual assault, harassment, and violence. And so that incorporates a lot of different things. It means, going back to one of our early slides, students are our institutional brand, and so you don't want to put public relations before a student's well-being, because the students are the lifeblood of our institutions, and it's one of the reasons that the University of Oregon case is particularly resonating with a lot of folks, because it appears that the school put their image, their brand of having a robust athletic department with a robust basketball team ahead of making sure that every single student was valued and safe. And so it's really important that your staff is prepared to know how to respond in situations like that. And again, valuing students. Seek to understand what they need. Seek to understand what it is that you can do to help them, and that includes listening to them. If they say, I need you to leave me alone and give me space, value that. That's really important, because every person processes things in different ways, and for some people there might be other things that are coming up for them that they need to figure out, and so it's okay. Value what they need. Practice, practice, practice. So we've been saying this whole time, it's really difficult to have some of these conversations. And so it's our responsibility as professionals to know what you should avoid saying, including legal issues or things that might be triggering. And it's also important to know, like, how might you approach a situation. So any kind of training that you as a professional staff member does with your student staff or with your fellow professional staff members, it really should include copious amounts of practicing having these conversations. Sit down with a colleague and practice, what does this conversation look like? Know what to say. And if you're confused, ask. If you're speaking with a student, it's okay to ask, is it all right if we suggest this? It's okay. Let them know that you are doing the best that you can and that you care about them, and that's really important. It's also important to know how healthy and strong programming around these issues look like. So again, we work in housing. Many of us have resident assistants or supervised professionals who are doing programming in some capacity. And so knowing how to program around sexual violence prevention and how to establish healthy relationships is really important. And of course, this might require extra specific training for staff at all levels, because it goes back to making sure that programming won't perpetuate harm. You always want to ensure that you are minimizing harm to any student. So you don't want to program in ways that perpetuate harm or perpetuate myths. But programming can be a really useful tool in establishing that goes back to that normalization of violence. What actually is normal, healthy behaviors, and what are violent behaviors? And letting our students know that up front, and letting our staff know that up front too, because as Jen said, we know that this is an issue that affects our staff members and our faculty members as well. And finally, collaborate. There are so many different other campuses on our campuses, or so many different offices on our campuses, and reach out to them. See if there are people that you can work with. I myself, I currently am working with our violence prevention specialist in our OASIS program, which is our sexual assault center on campus. And I am working with her around marketing and talking about Title IX. And we want to create something, some kind of poster series for the beginning of the academic year so that right off the bat, when students move in, they have a resource that says, this is what falls under Title IX. This is how you can report something if you have any concerns or questions, and this is who you can talk to. So from the very first day, students have a resource. They are clued into knowing what their options are should anything happen, or if they just want to talk with anybody. This is you, Jen.
I know, I'm going, sorry.
Gotcha, you're okay.
So finally, one of the things we wanted to say to you is, as I've mentioned before, how do you stay on top of all of this, and in terms of the White House Task Force, and what other people can you get in touch with, whether it be within AIMHO? Maybe it's a way for us to continue to have this dialogue, and how do you get this whole entire issue brought to the forefront of everyone's mind? I find that what has happened on all of the campuses I've ever been on, it doesn't really rise necessarily to the attention of our administrators or faculty until something huge happens and it becomes more public information, which is what Alex is saying about what happened. It could be at any of these institutions now, maybe 65 or 68 of them. What did they do in the handling of this, and how did they make the victim feel throughout the process? Is it possible for you to take a proactive step and get a campus task force together of a wide variety of people who could help to inform how you want to respond to these? An example that I use here at the U of A is we're working very diligently not only to administratively follow up with these cases, but what are we doing at the exact time that the incident happens? We had an incident happen on our campus last year with a sexual assault, and one of the feedback points that the victim said to us later on was, she said, there was no one in the room with me who was not a police officer for over 2 hours. So what can we as an institution say to show care? That there's just someone else there to sit with the person. You don't necessarily have to take down notes. You don't necessarily have to be there for any administrative purpose, but to just show care and concern for what the student might be possibly going through. Every one of our campuses has a particular climate, and how often are you really looking at climate surveys? Where are the old ones that somebody must have done, even if it's 5 years ago? And how can you influence your administration to continue to think about climate? What does it feel like to be a student here? Irrespective of whether you yourself have actually had a crime happen against you, how do you feel about the place? Do you feel like it's safe? Do you feel as if they care? Do you feel as if the process has always made sense to you? Confidential reporters. One of the things that's fascinating to me about the role that our RAs play is this confidentiality, and how do we apply one standard to our RAs, and then another standard, if you want to put in a confidential report, this is the exact avenue to do it. I often feel like sometimes in our organizations, maybe a desk assistant would not possibly know how to do that, and they might be one of the first contact points for a student who feels as if they've been victimized. Make sure that everyone knows the exact process for, here's one avenue that you could go through to talk to somebody who works here, or here's another avenue if you want to put in a confidential report. And finally, never giving up on this advocacy training and awareness programming. I recently started thinking about the other layers within our organization that might actually interact with a student in ways that you might not otherwise think of. And one of the examples we have is we have an assignments process, obviously, that now that we're full at this time of the year, we have a lot of personal phone calls. So there's many human beings who work for us who are having pretty difficult conversations with people who are asking for an exception so that they can have a space on campus. And in my candor with you, some of those things say, I have anxiety and I can't possibly live off campus, or please let me live on campus. But also, I started thinking, would it possibly also include, I have been sexually assaulted in high school and I don't want to live far from campus. How do I make sure that everybody who possibly would answer the phone for us in a role that might not otherwise ever have needed to be aware of this before, and how do we train them and make sure that they become really positive advocates?
And so we're wrapping up here, but we wanted to leave you with some more resources. So we did mention the White House Task Force. It's something that really every professional should read because it's very illuminating. They provide a lot of different guidelines and different things that we as professionals, we're going to need to talk about in our departments and figure out how do we craft a really intentional and purposeful response. Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, as I mentioned earlier, it's a really great resource, and particularly when understanding intersections of gender and of different identities, it can be really useful. And Know Your Nine is an organization that was actually started by a student who she was so disenchanted with her institution's response to how when she went to them saying that she was assaulted, she was so disenchanted with how they responded that she created this organization. She did file a complaint, and this entire website is basically a coalition. It's dedicated to a place for students to come together and report things that they're seeing on their campus that maybe they're not sure falls under Title IX. It offers them resources and guidance about what does and does not fall under Title IX, and different ways that they, as students, can respond, can mobilize to change their institution or enact positive policies. So we're going to open it up for questions now, and I will let Stacy lead us in that.
That is correct. So thank you, Alex, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to type those in right now. I actually have a question.
Awesome.
So, you mentioned earlier about when a student comes to you with a concern or something that's happened, about approaching that. How do you do the legal thing as well as showing the compassion? And you were saying that some people process that in their own way, so some may push you away, but then there will be some that will really want that support. How can you tell the difference, and how do you know? So, Jen, when you mentioned the guy who was saying that nobody was in the room with him, how can you determine whether or not you should be there or that person does not want that type of support at that moment?
That's a really great question, and I think it depends on the context. So I think where we see more students less likely to want to let us in right away is when the police are called. So it's the immediate aftermath. Typically when a student comes to my office, they're at the point where they want to talk to someone. But regardless, I have a rule of asking them, how do you feel about talking about this? Is there any place that you want to, any other place that we could go to make you feel more comfortable? And how, like, constantly asking, how are you feeling right now? How are you feeling right now? Do you feel that I'm understanding you? So asking questions saying, am I understanding this situation correctly? And so I think it's okay if you're unsure. The big thing, especially when a student has perhaps just been assaulted, a really big thing is letting that person feel like they're in control, that they have some semblance of they know what's going on in their life. And so lending them the power is really important. So if I've been in a situation before where a student has just reported that they've been assaulted that night, and it's a matter of asking, how are you feeling? What can I do for you? So that they're the ones who get a say. And so asking, do you want me to stay with you right now? Do you want me to talk with you right now? Would you like me to sit next to you? Because again, some students might want their own personal space. They might not want to be touched or near anyone at all. Some students might really want, actually, could I hold your hand? Can I sit near you? So it's okay to ask. And just remember that it's okay to ask. You're not going to cause more harm by asking them what they need in that moment.
Great, thank you so much. And to follow up, what do you do when you're getting upper management who's also very concerned about the legal aspects of it? What do you do when you get that pushback from upper management to say, oh, this is our policy, you need to do this, versus what the student would need?
It's a really good question. Jen, do you want to talk about that?
I think the biggest thing is to constantly be able to articulate the students' needs and also what you have done in the past or what other institutions do in those situations. I think sometimes, we had a major crisis on our campus this spring, and although it wasn't a sexual assault, it really was an opportunity again for me to re-educate our administration about how we want to show care. And Alex was, excellent in her approach to just say, what do you want right at this point? And in the example that we had some students who began to get counseling from someone in our counseling department, and I asked the student, is this what you want? Student replied yes. The counseling started, and then he changed his mind. He didn't want to talk about it. And I happened to be walking by, and I just said, that his face doesn't look right. So just making sure that you're constantly paying attention to those other cues. Mm-hmm. Yet when you talk about administration, you always have to say, here's what we do in these situations. Here's what we're trying to do for the community. Here's the ways in which we have really made sure that we've left everyone an opportunity to be heard. And I think sometimes as we were talking before about branding, I do think there's certain folks at the institution who that is their role. How does this appear outside in the court of public opinion in terms of the care that we provide? Yet I think we're the best people to know what it is that we should and should not be doing in those situations. And it might not be the same level of care that they would want us to give, meaning they might want us to give less and have family members come in and provide that. But sometimes we have to remember we have a lot of students on our campuses with no other support system. So it's different if there's a whole group of people who can come in and support someone. But I think the game changes when there's not anyone who can do that.
Thank you. So Alex, we have a question. Did you see that, or would you like me to read that?
I have not seen any question. I would love for you to read it.
Okay. I represent an American Indian college. We have the capacity for 380 residents. I am drafting internal policies and steps for my RA staff to handle these situations as educators. Is anyone willing to share their stellar policies as a model?
Ooh, that's an awesome question. And I think, I don't know if you want to address this, Jen, or...
No, you can. No, you can.
Okay. I mean, I'm not too familiar. I think when it comes to stellar policies, knowing the context is important. So if you're on tribal land, I know that there might be some things that are different. But I think a really good guideline to remember is it's okay to ask students too what kind of for their input when crafting policies. So that goes back to that task force idea. What are things that, because there might be things that students don't understand. And so, for instance, on our campus, I was actually part of a task force. And something that students said a lot was, we just don't understand the process. And so when you're creating policies, letting students in so that they have an understanding of, okay, at any moment I can communicate this process. So I won't say I have stellar policies because I think at this point we've demonstrated that most institutions can probably reevaluate what policies they're putting in place. But I think it's really important to get that input and make sure that at any point in time, any person who has felt harassed or threatened, they know who they can turn to. And I think that's a big problem is what we're seeing right now. And I'll speak for the University of Arizona. We don't do a very good job of communicating how to report to our Office of Title IX. It's feedback that we've consistently gotten from students and staff. And that there's not a lot of transparency in the process. So students will submit a complaint and then they don't know what happens. And so I think the really important thing whenever you're crafting any policy is to really get as many different minds in the process so that they can consider all different facets of what that might look like, especially for students, because you really that's who you want to know what the policy is. You want students to be able, on their very first day, to say, I know who I need to talk to if I need to report something like this. So I realize it's not the most helpful answer. I don't know if Jen has a more specific policy or something that she can think of, but I would say that when crafting any policies, it's really important to consider all kinds of input and what it is that people might need from a process.
I still think it might be worthwhile if you want to look online at institutions that are similar size as yours to see what they have put together, even in their Dean of Students office, that or housing. I think both, because then I think you could get some really good ideas of what are the common threads. I mean, at an institution the size of ours, it's just, to me, I always feel like this place is a battleship. And part of what Alex was just talking about in terms of I file this complaint and I don't know anything that happens is I think that's because we're stymied by bureaucracy, and you might be in a little bit of a different situation. But I think if you would put a call out on the listserv to see if people would just be willing to share with you their resources, I think you would get a lot of responses.
I will say something that this is something that's been repeatedly been brought up through different resources, is including that confidential reporting component. Because right now there's so many policies where if a student is assaulted, immediately the police are called, and so the first people the student is speaking with are police officers. And the fact is, not all police officers are very good when talking about assault, and some of them might perpetuate some of those myths. They might ask, what were you wearing? How much did you have to drink? They might ask different questions that could be very triggering. And so what we're finding is so many different reports, including the White House Task Force, is really emphasizing having a confidential reporter. And so we're not even sure what that looks like at the U of A yet, but figuring out how could we incorporate someone who is a confidential reporter, who could sit in a room with a student and let them know their options in a way that makes them really feel valued. Because what we know, statistics show that if a student speaks with a confidential reporter first, they are more likely to report to the police after, but having that confidential reporter really helps clarify all of their options, and it makes them, usually confidential reporters are trained in ways that are much more effective than police officers. And so students feel more comfortable instead of just going to the police, where oftentimes, unfortunately, we still have many students who are not believed by the police. Not even many students, many reports of violence. It's one of the most underreported and under-prosecuted crimes. And so people don't always feel like going to the police is their best option. So in finding some way of incorporating confidential reporters in your policies, I think that's going to really help certainly increase reporting, because that's the trend we've already seen. But it also helps because it's one person who really understands the issue that can lay out all of the options available to the student right there and make them feel safe in a way that sometimes, unfortunately, the police just can't.
Thank you for
I
that.
agree.
So we're over time, but we do have one more question. So does anyone have any possible funding resources they are aware of to apply to expand and develop these resources?
That's great. I don't know off the top of my head. I would say looking at Know Your 9 would probably be a good resource, because I know that there are different grants available. For instance, our OASIS Center, our Sexual Assault Violence Prevention Specialists, they do look into getting grants and funding through that way. So I would say it's worthwhile to perhaps look at a few different resources, or connect if you have a campus health center. Connecting with different things or looking for grants, I think, is a good idea. I don't know any funding off the top of my head, but I do know that on our campus that is something that our violence prevention specialist does, is she looks for grants and gets funding that way.
And we are looking for grants to fund that position. That would most likely, it may end up being a confidential reporter, but it would definitely be a support person. We do think that there's community resources for that kind of advocacy in the middle of the night.
Well, thank you so much, Alex and Jen, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you haven't already, please type in the chat box who you are, what your institution is, and how many people are with you. And I want to thank you all for participating. And the presentation will be up on our AIMHO website momentarily or soon. And please keep that in mind, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Are we still on?
Yes.
Okay. I do have to get running to another meeting, so I'm going to have to hang up on you, but what'd you think?
Great. Thank you.
Awesome.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, all.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to go run in. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Stacy. That seemed to go much more smoothly than last time.
Yeah.
Apart from the one little hiccup where we lost Alexandra for a while.
Right. I don't know what happened with that, but thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So you take care. Oh, and one other thing. I think I missed part of the beginning of the recording. Is that? I don't know how much.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and you have a great day.
You too. Thanks, Stacy.
Bye.